Hi, thank you for coming. I do not disagree with a lot that you just said. That's why I'm here. Yeah, so let's talk about institutions, because you're saying we should not blame the institutions. I have an example, and please tell me why you think, that person per se is not victimized. So let's start with the beginning of a life. You're a baby, you were born into a really poor family, in a really poor community, where the school is not good. Where crimes are high. You as a baby, I think, you're quite helpless there. And I would, according to my thinking, I would say that's quite, unequal. And that is, I feel like that person, because if you think about education, that should be a public good. In my opinion, it should be provided equally in all communities instead of just based on, how rich your house is. Could you respond to that?
So so if I'm getting your question straight, 'cause there's a bit of an echo here. So you're suggesting that children grow up in unequal circumstances because of the school district they go to. Not all schools are equal. There are a lot of public schools that are garbage, and so kids don't have an equal access to success.
Yes, and I feel like in my world, in my political thinking, I think that is inequality, and that is institutions failing people.
So I agree with you that not all public schools are good, and I agree with you that there is such a thing as inequality. Of course there's such a thing as inequality. We're not all born in the same place. We're not all born equally intelligent. We're not all born with equal gifts. Some of us are born smart but short and will never play in the NBA. We're not all born, this is just a truism. The question is there inequity? Right? Is there an equity that needs to be remedied? And the question then is, what's the best way to remedy that inequity? So when you say that there's inequality, is that because there are a bunch of rich people who are screwing those poor kids out of a good school? I don't think so, because we're spending oodles of money in the public schools, particularly in poor areas, and it's not paying off very well. What I would suggest is that the best possible solution is to devolve those dollars back to parents who presumably care about those kids more than the public school system does, and allow them to choose the schools for their children. So I can agree with you that there's inequality. Then the question becomes, okay, how do we solve that problem? So again, inequality and inequity are not the same thing, and equating the two, I think, is a mistake. You can go follow up, that's fine.
Thank you. So I feel like, if we're getting really scholarly and academic here, that is exactly what Rousseau is saying, essentially talking about natural inequality and contrived inequality. Natural inequality would be inequality that you're saying, inequity would be the contrived one. And I feel like now in our society, the institutions is contributing to the ultimate contrived inequality, in the sense that children just do not have access to the same level of education. Granted, if they
if we're going to construct utopia and then suggest all children are going to have the same level of education, that's just not reality. Okay, there's no place on earth that has that, because that's just not the case. So you're right that there's a difference between difference in smarts and difference in the poverty situation in which you grew up. But the truth is that the biggest inequality the biggest inequity and inequality, I would say, is parents who decide to get pregnant out of wedlock. I mean, if you want to look at academic underperformance, it has much less to do with the school that you go to and much more to do with your family situation at home. Again, I'm not arguing with you that any of these things are a problem. The question is, quote unquote, who's to blame? And I think this is where we get into a problem in politics, because the idea is that the person to blame must be the rich guy down the street. I don't think it's the rich guy's fault. I think that there are certain things in life that just aren't fair. And then the question becomes, okay, how do we maximize opportunity without invading the rights of somebody else? And I think the easiest way to do that is to let people keep more of their own money and to do more to privatize the school system and give people more choice. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Hi, first off, I just want to say thank you for speaking as a fellow Jewish conservative. Thank you so much for coming.
It's just the two of us, man.
So I wanted to ask you, do you believe that there's an explanation for why victimization has become the main tactic of the far left to gain support of the people?
Yes. So I think, first of all, I do think victimization was always a tactic of the far left. It was just economic victimization, right? Marxism is based on the idea that the proletariat are going to rise up and overthrow the bourgeois, that there's this vast group of underprivileged people, as they call it, who are going to rise up and they're going to break the chains that bind them and take over the world. So it was always based on this notion that you're being victimized by somebody else. But in the 1960s particularly, it was clear that as America was thriving so much in the 1950s economically, and America had become this great world power, the prominent world power in terms of the economy, it was very hard to make the case to people who were not as wealthy that you need to rise up against the country that's creating all your wealth. And so instead, what the left decided to do was misdirect into a legitimate grievance, which was an ethnic-based and sex-based grievance, which made a lot more sense in the 1950s and 60s than it does in 2017. And so there's this idea that if we identify you as groups, we can use those groups to tear down the American infrastructure, this system that's been built by white men for the privilege of white men. And we couldn't tear that down based on class, because it turns out a lot of poor people in the United States still wanted to get rich, and they need that system to get rich. But you can do it based on group identity. Because if you can make women feel that the system is designed to keep them down, if you can make black people feel like the system is designed to keep them down, and then you can tell them that it's the capitalist system more generally that is designed to keep them down, and that whole system, the whole superstructure is rife with racism, it has to be torn out root and branch. If you can do that, then you can actually build a movement on the back of that. And that's what you're seeing in the Democratic Party actually right now. It's fascinating to watch the conflict between sort of the Obama identity politics Democratic Party and the Bernie Sanders Socialist Democratic Party. Because that's actually an old battle, right? I mean, that's the battle between economic, class distinction-based victimization and identity politics-based victimization, which is really more what Obama used in 2012 to win re-election.
So would you say this is more of like get-rich-quick scheme, or if I can't be rich, no one can?
Well, I think that it depends on which people you're talking about. The people who buy into the idea of victimization, I don't think it's a get-rich-quick scheme so much as an I feel victimized scheme and I don't feel like taking responsibility. But for the people at the top, I think that it actually is a get-rich-quick scheme. I think the people at the top very often know exactly what they are doing and know, because they don't live like this, right? I mean, Barack Obama didn't live his life thinking of himself as a dramatic victim of society until he decided to write Dreams for My Father and revise everything, right? But the fact is that Barack Obama is a guy who really achieved his whole life. I mean, he was an achiever. And if he had been sitting around thinking how victimized he was his whole life, it would have been very difficult for him to get where he got.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Barack Obama has been terrible from beginning to end. He's divided us along racial and sexual lines. He's divided us along every line he could find. He came in with a great promise. Because the expectations for Obama were so high and he fell so short, he's really divided America. I think he's trolled the Republican Party into irrelevance, and I think that he's taken his own party to Bernie Sanders land. And I think that, he's done that through policy, but he's mostly done that through his style. When Obama was elected, there was this great hope that he was finally going to help conciliate the greatest conflict that has ever torn the nation, the racial conflict, right? And instead he came in on the basis and governed on the basis that if you oppose him, it must be because you are black. And if there are imbalances in terms of equality, that is inequity, right? Inequality equals inequity. So if more black people than white people are going to prison proportionately, that must be because people are racist. It can't just be because too many black people are committing crimes, right? So by doing that, he's divided people along these lines. And it's you can see it in the Gallup polls. I mean, people now feel that the racial conflict in the country is at heights it hasn't been for decades. That to me is the most damaging thing, is that he's reverted American politics to a form of tribalism that I find very scary. In terms of his actual policy, Obamacare is destroying the medical system. It's raising premiums for people who are in the system. It's going to end up with an actual form of care that really is just redistribution of care. Which is going to hurt the people who are youngest and the people who are oldest. And there's a reason Ezekiel Emanuel, who designed his Obamacare program, says he wants to die at 75. They're going to end up redistributing health care, and they're going to end up restricting it. As far as the economy, his economic policies, if you look at American history, every time there's a big bust, there is then a similarly sized boom, unless you have a massive government policy like FDR and Hoover, or unless you have a massive government policy like Barack Obama. So on domestic policy, he's been terrible. He's pushed government into realms it never was before and created conflicts that weren't there before. So, for example, on the gay marriage issue, my position on this has been that the government should get completely out of the business of marriage. I think the government sucks at everything, and they suck at that too. So, what Obama has done instead is he said, okay, let's enshrine same-sex marriage for the purpose of cramming down on religious institutions the idea that they must participate in something they believe is sinful. That's not live and let live. That's live like me or I won't let you live. Right? And that's dastardly stuff. When it comes to his foreign policy is the worst of all of his policies. He set the world, I mean, it's cliche at this point, but he set the world on fire. His Libya war was a disaster and handed guns to terrorists. He talks about handing guns to ISIS. He actually did that in Libya. He talks about, Syria is a disaster area. The attempt to make Iran into a regional power with the assumption that they're going to moderate themselves is utter asininity. It's just foolishness on an unbelievable scale. His handing over of power to Russia in Crimea is going to end with NATO possibly breaking apart because Russia's just going to continue encroaching on outlying portions of the NATO alliance and basically say, fine, come and get me, coppers. And he's allowed the Chinese to expand their realm of influence into the South China Sea. And you're going to see increasing Chinese intransigence and aggressiveness because China demographically this happens with every country where you have a lot more males than females. China demographically, there are 125 males for every 100 females. When you have a lot of excess young men, there's only one thing you can do with those people, and that's put them in the army. And that's basically what China has done. So they're going to get very aggressive on the world stage very quickly. So every aspect, Latin America, of course, has become a disaster too. Every aspect of this presidency has been terrible, but when you have the media on your side, and when you're a likable fellow, and he is likable on camera, then those are assets that matter. And this is why when people say, you know, how could we end up with a reality TV show host like Trump running? He's the second one to do it. Right? Obama's the first. You don't do interviews with the lady who sat in a bathtub full of Cheerios and Fruit Loops, and then tell me about how terrible it is that Donald Trump used to be on The Apprentice.